Well, the more we speak openly about psychology in society, the more certain terms become part of common language. As good as a more open society can be, using these words in everyday conversation and using them wrong or out of context could cause a problem. Joining us this morning is registered psychologist Lisa Rowbottom for more on this. So, Lisa, can you give us some examples? How do you see this in everyday language at this point?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that we use terms that used to be reserved for clinical conditions to refer to part of our day-to-day life. So we might say, like, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. And as well, it's fine to use those terms, but then when someone actually has a disorder, people tend to say things like, well, just get over it. I just went for a walk and I felt better, or I just, slept a little extra and everything was fine. And so there's this challenge because now we don't differentiate between what is a clinical issue and what is just part of the human experience.
And that can be tough. And what's the danger for people who have been diagnosed to sort of hear those sorts of things commonplace in everyday language?
I think a lot of times they'll come into my office and sit down and say, like, I feel like I'm not strong enough. I'm not, something different or wrong with me because everybody else can overcome this feeling of anxiousness and I can't. Nobody else feels this way. Nobody else thinks this way. And I think that it almost sort of trivializes to a degree what they're dealing with because it is so intense and so complex and so different from what people experience on the day-to-day.
What would you say to people who have this temptation to sort of self-diagnose without going to a professional, but rather sort of reading the symptoms that they define in themselves and then diagnosing and saying things like, oh, I have anxiety or I have depression, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. I would really encourage them to speak to a professional. I think that we tend to see a lot of things in ourselves. The running joke is your first psychology course you ever take in university, you diagnose yourself with everything. You walk away thinking you've got everything under the sun, when in reality you don't, because these are clinical manifestations of things on a spectrum. So we all have pieces of this. We all experience some anxiety, but we don't have disordered anxiety. And so if you're not aware of the differentiation, you're going to say, oh yeah, I have an anxiety disorder. And, maybe you might decide to talk to your doctor about medication or pursue a diagnosis when really it's everyday anxiety. It's not the disordered kind.
When's the tipping point for that? When you think, okay, maybe this is just everyday anxiety, but perhaps this is going into something further. Is there a bellwether for you on when you should talk to a professional?
Generally when it's hindering you from doing something you want to do or it's interfering with your life. So even if it's not to the level of disordered anxiety, it may be high enough level anxiety that you want to just work to bring it down because it's getting in the road. Maybe you're anxious around other people and you can't go to your friend's birthday party because the anxiety is too high. Or maybe you have a phobia and you can't get on an airplane. It's stopping you from enjoying your life the way everybody can.
And when talking about sort of everyday things, how would you suggest talking about them, using them different words?
I think that, what's in our language is going to remain in our language. I think it's more just the understanding that, when somebody's referring to anxiety in day-to-day, they're referring to something different than someone who's diagnosed. And so if you're diagnosed, that doesn't mean that you're different from other people or you're weaker than other people or you should be able to manage like other people. It just means that, you are struggling with things that have changed the chemistry of your brain, whereas other people, yes, there's shifts in brain chemistry, but they're in a normal range. Okay. So probably just, maybe accentuating the disordered piece of it. I have anxiety disorder versus I'm anxious may help.
Sure. Well, helping us navigate forward as things open up in this way, which is a good thing, ultimately. Yes. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate your advice. If you'd like to learn more about Lisa and Sojourn Psychology, you can go to sojo.ca.